This is it, y'all. We are coming to the very end of our lecture for this class. It's been a wild ride. I'm really bummed that we're not physically together right now because this next section, there's a lot of really fun activities that we do to understand different kinds of ways to listen. So sorry that this is boring. If we were going to be in class together, it'd be much more interesting. So let's talk about listening skills because just because we have the ability to listen does not mean that we are necessarily good at it. And we've talked about different kind of communication barriers we can encounter. Talked about message related barriers. It's all about the problem with the message. Maybe it's complex language, or maybe you're not trying to relate your message to the audience. And then we had external barriers that were all about like problems with the environment, like being too hot or a loud noise. And we talked about internal barriers, and these are problems that your audience is going to have because they maybe are not able to or are not motivated to listen to you. So poor listening skills are an internal communication barrier because the problem is within the audience. And even though it is a problem within the audience, we can still do everything we can as speakers to try and understand listening and how our audience is going to listen to try and relate to them. But also, for the most part, this kind of content is going to relate to us as just being actual audience members, as people who just have regular conversations. So, one thing we need to understand is that there is a big difference between hearing and listening. So, if you try to think to yourself or try to explain to somebody, what's the difference between hearing and listening? What I love to do when we're in class is I'll ask someone, hey, who can tell me the difference between hearing and listening without using those words, the definition? And people always end up saying something like, hearing is like when you hear something. And I'm like, wow, thank you for telling me that hearing means when you hear something. I totally know what that means. So it's really hard to explain without using those words. But luckily, I have given you the definitions. So, hearing is a physiological process. And we talked a little bit about this word when we talked about speech anxiety, how there's some physiological symptoms of speech anxiety. Those were things that your body does when you get nervous. So, they're physiological things, those are physical things, they're happening in your body. So, hearing is a physiological process. So it's physical, something that your body just does. It's conducted by your ears and your brain. We don't have control over hearing. Like it's like your blood flowing or your lungs taking in air, like expanding and contracting. Like you don't do that. Your body does that on its own. Same thing with hearing. Like you can't control how you hear something unless you're using a hearing aid, obviously. But then listening, on the other hand, is a psychological process. And again, we also talked about psychological parts of speech anxiety as well. Those are all kind of the mind tricks you play on yourself that make you nervous. So listening is psychological. It happens in your mind. So it's the process of paying attention to the messages that you're receiving and making sense out of the information that you receive. I want us to make sure we understand that listening isn't really just making sense out of sounds. Like it's much more about paying attention to that message and processing it, especially processing the nonverbals that go with it. Because you might hear someone say something, but as you're paying attention to the nonverbals they use, you can realize they're saying something quite different and your listening is enhanced. And so, yeah, listening is, hearing is a big part of listening, but I want us to know listening isn't really dependent on hearing. So, like for example, if someone is hearing impaired, it's not like they go their entire life without receiving any kind of communication. Like they communicate in other ways. So, if someone's deaf, they probably use sign language or they'll just read a message. But like they have to pay careful attention because if someone is like using sign language and then you look away for a second and then look back, you missed a whole bunch of hand gestures. And so you missed part of the message. You don't have the entire meaning because you weren't quote unquote listening. And so even though that listening wasn't happening with their ears, listening was still happening in a different way. Now, I know that listening mostly involves hearing. I'm not crazy. I'm not saying that a deaf person can listen or hear because I know they cannot. But I'm just trying to get us to expand that listening isn't just the sounds that we make, it's the nonverbals, trying to create that deeper meaning of the message that you're receiving. And normally right now we would play a really fun game, but we're not all together. And I try to think if there's some way we could like do like some kind of like class Zoom call and we could all do it together, but that was overwhelming and I didn't think it would actually work. Um, so next year when we're back in school, maybe I'll let y'all know when the next freshman class is doing this game and I'll invite y'all to come play it because it's really fun. So we have the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is just what your body does to receive sound, but listening is your mind actually processing it and creating a message. There are also different types of listening. So one type of listening is called active listening. And I believe we've talked about this in class. We've even talked about conversation skills. So active listening means that you are reacting to the message, and you're doing that to demonstrate that you're gathering the data that's being presented. So if someone's talking to you, you might smile and nod to show that you are listening and you are processing their message. This can be an encouragement to a speaker because it shows that the audience is processing what's being said, that they like what's being said, or even if the speaker says something that you don't understand and you might kind of furrow your eyebrows a little bit to look kind of confused, that can be helpful to them so they can know they need to maybe re-explain a concept a little more clearly. So that's one type of listening. In active listening, you are reacting to the message to show that you are gathering the data. But then there's also passive listening. A passive listening is still listening because it is a type of listening. So listening is still in the name, it's passive listening. It's processing a message without reacting to it. Now, you might be fully receiving the information because, again, listening is still happening. So you're hearing that sound, you're looking at those nonverbals, you're using your mind to create meaning from it. So you may be fully receiving the information, but you're just not responding. Because sometimes, like, think about the way you sit in class. Like, you probably don't actively listen to your teacher's boring lecture. Like your friends, you might actively listen to them. So there's different situations where you might actively listen and situations you might passively listen. They are both listening. They just look different because active listening is reacting and passive listening is not reacting. However, this can be discouraging to a speaker because they have no way to really gauge if their audience is listening or not. So they might think they're being boring or they're not a very good speaker. So more often than not, we want to actively listen because that is generally more encouraging to our speakers. And then normally in class, we'll do a fun little activity and y'all get to do a cute little skit. But we can't do that because we're not all together. So I'm just going to teach y'all about these things. So the next thing we're going to learn about is something called non-listening. Now, passive listening sounds like it's not listening because the word passive kind of has like a bad connotation to us, but it's still a type of listening. It has the word passive in it because you're not reacting. But non-listening, that word non means no or not. So not listening means that you're providing the appearance of listening without actually paying complete attention to the message. As we go through the next slide, I'm sure y'all will hear these examples and go, oh, I do that all the time. And maybe we can feel a little bit of conviction about that because these are not good. So non-listening and passive listening are not the same. Because again, passive listening is still listening, but non-listening is not listening. That is definitely a test question because people always forget about it. So don't forget, passive listening is still listening. It's just listening without reacting. And non-listening is not listening. So let's learn about the 4 types of non-listening. So first, there's pseudo-listening. This is when someone is going to attempt to hide their inattention to the speaker's message. This can give the appearance of active listening because this is when, like, you're sitting in class and I'm saying something and I'm looking right at you, but you're not really paying attention. You're kind of like smiling and nodding, so I don't ask you a question. So you're trying to hide that you're not really paying attention. So pseudo means fake or like hidden or disguise. So you're trying to like fake that you're listening. So pseudo listening can look like active listening, but you're not actually listening. Nothing's going on in the mind up there. Similarly, we also have glazing over. So glazing over is just daydreaming instead of listening to the message. This can give the appearance of passive listening because a really nice speaker might want to give you the benefit of the doubt and think, oh yeah, they're probably listening, they're just not really reacting. No, like, I'm probably looking right at you, I'm just not really thinking about anything. So glazing over is daydreaming. Now, pseudo listening and glazing over are both not good. They're not aggressively harmful to a speaker because you could be doing lots of other things. A speaker may not be able to be like, hey, you're pseudo listening right now, unless they ask you a very specific question you don't know the answer to it. But it can be a little hurtful if they're like, okay, like, I see their eyes are pretty glazed over. They're probably not actually paying attention. And that can hurt your feelings if you're working on a speech and people aren't listening. So these can be kind of like not aggressively hurtful. The next 2 examples are aggressive and they are hurtful and they are not ethical ways to listen. So the next type of non-listening is ambushing. So this is selective listening. And this is where like you are selecting what you're listening to, what you're going to give your most attention to. So selective listening, the audience is going to ignore the strengths of a message and hear only the weaknesses. So now that we've learned about logical fallacies, y'all can kind of see that for some of those, selective listening can come in maybe for straw man or for ad hominem. So like for selective listening, for straw man, perhaps, like if my mom said I couldn't get a dog and then I was like, okay, I understand this, but why do you hate puppies? It's like I'm not really paying attention to her full argument that we can't afford to get a dog right now, or where would the dog go, or I'm about to move. Why do I need a dog right now, or something? So instead of listening to her full argument, I'm just selecting parts of it and then I'm going to manipulate it into what I think I can beat, or just change her argument entirely. So that would be ambushing because you're not hearing all of what they have to say and trying to process and understand it. You're just picking out only the weaknesses. So that's not very good. You're not giving the speaker the full chance to prove themselves. You're just picking and choosing what you want to hear. And then prejudging is also bad. This is when you enter into a presentation with a judgment already formed. So you are prejudging. Pre means before, so you're prejudging. You're going into the presentation and you already have your mind made up about the message that's being delivered. And that's not ethical because you're just basically wasting your time in the speakers. Like, why are you even here if you already have your mind made up about what they're going to say and how you're going to feel about it? So that's not good. You don't want to waste your time or theirs. And I'm not saying that you have to like give up everything you believe about everything just because someone is speaking about it. There are absolutely ways that you can have your own beliefs and opinions and ideas, but also go into a speech and be like, oh yeah, I'm excited to learn about what their perspective is. Because hearing someone else's perspective about something can it can make you more smart. It can help you know what other people are talking about and what they believe so you can engage with them better with your own message. And it can help you enhance your own beliefs. If you're like, oh man, like after hearing what they said about that thing, it really reinforces my belief about this thing. So, like, you don't have to forsake your ideas, but you still want to go into the presentation and be open to hear what they have to say. Like, they put together all this time and effort to make this message for you. Like, you owe it to them to go in and, like, yes, you can have your idea about the message if you already know about it. Be open to what they want to say too. Basically, for all of these, just make sure that you are being genuine, that you want to actually go in and you want to understand what their perspective is. You want to learn from them. You're not just going to hear what you want to hear. You're not going to just cling to your prior notions about what you think you know about this topic. And you're going to actually try to listen, not just pretend to be listening. And then that is all we have for today. We have an assignment, but I think I'm assigning it tomorrow. Yep, I'm assigning it on, well, not tomorrow. I'm assigning it on Thursday. So that's all we have for today. Those are the differences between hearing and listening, different types of listening, and the types of non-listening. Goodbye.